For 30 years, Keith Brown has been tracking how families have been able to stay afloat on the great waves of social change that have swept the plains of southern Iwate. Takie Sugiyama Libra returned to her home country to ask what has happened to the old aristocracy and its descendants in a democratic and wildly commercial Japan. Bill Kelly has traced the 2-century record of agrarian changes and struggles for regional independence on the Shonai Plain in northwestern Honshu. Margaret Locke found that Japanese women experience the biological changes of menopause quite differently than most women do in North America. Ted Bester first went to Japan to study a neighborhood of mom-and-pop stores. Now he is investigating the world's largest wholesale fresh seafood market in Tokyo. And along Japan's endangered coastline, host David Platt discovered that shellfish diving still is profitable work in some locations, and much of it is done by older women. With this vast variety of experience, why are these field researchers still being asked,
"What's an anthropologist doing in Japan?"
I've gotten asked the same question, why don't I get malaria like a real anthropologist? I'll explain to an American that I'm an anthropologist studying Japan, and they'll say,
Bones.
"You dig up bones?"
Bones, yeah.
What does that tell us about Japan? And I have to explain that, no, I don't dig up bones. I study wholesale markets, and I study the ways in which family firms operate. I study communities in Tokyo that I wouldn't know a bone if it jumped out of the ground and bit me.
A fishbone.
A fishbone, perhaps. I don't think it's just American colleagues who don't understand what an anthropologist is doing in Japan. My sense is that lots of Japanese don't have a real appreciation of what an anthropologist is doing here either. Japanese like to talk about Japan as a country full of culture, but they use the term culture in a perhaps more limited sense than anthropologists do, in terms of referring to religion or traditions of various kinds, festivals. But what I try and explain to Japanese who ask me what, as an anthropologist, I'm doing in Japan, is to say that as an anthropologist, what interests me are human relationships and the kinds of institutions through which people govern their day-to-day lives.
But still, you're an anthropologist. And what I get sometimes from Japanese I've met for the first time is, but don't anthropologists study primitives? And sometimes they even spell it out. Often it's just left implicit. Are you really looking upon us as some kind of primitives or tribesmen? Shouldn't you be in Cambodia or Zaire or someplace like that? How do you answer that kind of question?
Well, certainly anthropology has been associated with the so-called primitive societies. The trouble is that no real primitive society exists anymore. And so anthropology has to change its orientation to survive. One of my colleagues who specializes in the Pacific, he said he envies me because Japan is such a rich culture. You never get tired, you never get bored. But he said he's bored with his subject. So simple. The significance or the goal of anthropology, as I see it, is to understand one's own culture through another culture by using it as a mirror. And in order to have that kind of self-reflection, the two cultures have to be close enough instead of something very exotic, distant, like New Guinea and so on. And Japan is a very good example of such mirror because it's close enough and yet different enough from the West.
Japan provides an alternative to looking at the implications of the whole modern, postmodern, developed, post-developed, whatever terms you want to use for economic, technological, cultural, social, educational development. What are the cultural alternatives to coping with that? Or what is the cultural base for facilitating those kinds of developments, if in fact those are the kinds of things you want to develop? Are they different if they are Japanese living in a society that has a different culture?
Are they different?
They are. They are, in fact.
Huh.
But I got into this 30 years ago, asking that question, and I was not so sure. That I thought maybe when Japan catches up, they will look like those of us from the Western world. They don't. And it was a dumb assumption.
I certainly encountered a variation of this, and that was when I was starting to study the traditional medical system. And many people would say, why do you want to study that old stuff? And I would explain that from my point of view, I was particularly interested in it because in the West we were concerned about the problems with modern medicine. And it seemed very clear that we had to turn back to traditional knowledge, so this empirical knowledge which is more than 1,000 years old, and to not just throw it to the winds.
How do you present yourself? How do you deal with this possible
Well,
misunderstanding?
I have to say that I have not myself been much challenged by that kind of a question, and I've always thought that it was due to a couple of things, the first of which is Ruth Benedict. The fact that an anthropologist could write a portrait of Japan that many people still hold to have some value. In a sense, she made it legitimate for anthropologists to be interested in Japan, and the other are the number of Japanese anthropologists. The notion of an anthropologist being interested in Japan has been seen by people as if not natural, at least valid and tolerable.
Tolerable. What brought you to Japan, first of all?
I went back to graduate school after fooling around a couple of years with the intention of going to Nepal. After a couple years of graduate school, my wife got interested in Japanese art history. And we faced the problem of my going off to learn Nepali and heading for that part of Asia, and her going off to learn Japanese and heading for that part of Asia. So I ended up switching to Japan, and part of the graduate school program was the summer after the first year when we were all sent to different parts of northern New England and eastern Canada. And it totally changed the way I looked at the place of small settlements in a society like the U.S. And so when the choice of coming to Japan, leaving Nepal came up, it struck me that I might find some similar dynamics at work in Japan.
I must confess that I didn't intend to do Japan, but then it so happened that I got married to American, which meant I have to find a permanent residence in the United States, and I have to build my career in the United States. And so what can I do then? And people then began to ask me to give lectures on Japan. And so I ended up as Japan specialist, despite myself. I'm sure that if I were in Japan throughout my life, I wouldn't be excited about Japan. And also, Japan offers so much. It's not a simple society.
Right.
And
Sure is
so
not.
every time I come back, it's I get stimulated, and I feel every time I come back, I feel I really know nothing about Japan.
Pure accident of personal history. When I was about 15, my father had a chance to come to Japan for 6 months and bring along the family. And I was a high school student in Seattle, Washington, and I had no particular interest in Japan, no particular desire to come to Japan. In fact, I wanted to stay home in Seattle with my friends rather than being dragged halfway around the world. But my father said, don't be ridiculous, this is a chance of a lifetime. You may never have another chance to go to Asia. And so at age 15, I found myself in Tokyo. I was fascinated by the fact that there were enough things similar to the United States in my daily life in Tokyo in 1967 that I could recognize what people were doing, but I realized I had no frame of reference for understanding why they were doing them.
It all looks familiar, at least on the surface, and then you go around the corner, and it's not quite the same, and yet it's not opposite. It's not
Right.
topsy-turvy land. What I like to tell students a lot of times is don't think of Japan as 180 degrees out from American life. People often start that way. Everything is different. Everything is
Yeah.
opposite. If anything, what makes it fascinating to me is that it's 18 degrees different, not 180.
And that's the reason I went there, because I wanted to look at the real Japan, thinking that all of these developments that are occurring in the urban centers are something new and Western and that kind of thing. I was totally wrong.
We were going to all the temples and all the shrines and doing all the things that one does, you know. And several of the people we got to know said, you know, what's the matter with you? That's all going to die out. That's we don't go for that kind of stuff
Yeah.
anymore. And they were obviously at some level concerned that they felt that we were trying to hold them in the past by focusing on all this culture. And they wanted to show us the Olympic stadium that had been finished.
new
They just had the
subways,
Olympics
sure,
and the new
sure.
subways and all the things like that. And we said, no, you know, we've got all that. We don't want to see that. But looking back on that, I've always taken that as being very significant, and I have very slowly transformed my way of looking and appreciate these modern things very much more.
But what got you interested in the topic? I mean, aside from what I think gets all of us interested in studying middle age, and that's
Because you become middle-aged, unfortunately.
It matters to you.
Happens to all of us. I think perhaps I came at it from a different angle from you in the first place, because I have spent all my teaching career working in a medical school as well as in an anthropology department. And this means that I've become very close to the medical profession and the kinds of thinking that they bring to the different stages of the life cycle. What I realized very quickly from a glance through the anthropological literature was that there had been virtually no research that had been done on the menopause in cross-cultural settings, and nothing that had been done with a large sample of women.
From your perspective, I take it didn't matter that much where you located.
I wanted a place that was a large enough a region where I could come to understand something more than a single settlement or a series of settlements. I also wanted a place where there had been some local history done, and Shonai turned out to be a place with a very active circle of local high school teachers and other interested antiquarians. And I also wanted a place where the people whom I was meeting seemed interested and willing to tolerate the presence of a foreign researcher. I happened to pick on the topic of irrigation, how people used water, water organizations. The problem that I then faced was that when I settled into this village, there wasn't any water running. I went out to walk around the fields and in the springtime, and there was no water in the canals. And it turned out there was no water in the canals because that year they were plowing over all the paddy fields to make new, larger rectangles of paddy fields, and that thoroughly disrupted the sort of thing I was going to study. But it did draw my attention to that project and what had set that project in motion, which got me interested in the situation before the war that had been the motivation for the post-war land reform.
How have you moved from that general fascination, which we have, to finding particular problems that are worth spending the kinds of months, sometimes years of work that goes into any kind of an anthropological study?
Well, it's a tough question, because you never know until you've found a problem if it's the right one. There's always a certain amount of uncertainty.
Well, if you know then.
If you know then, yeah, you may never know. I guess in one sense, I follow my nose. I find the projects that I've been involved with in the past have all been ones that stemmed from some deep personal curiosity. And I think what ultimately leads me to pick a particular problem is it something, first of all, is it feasible for me to do something?
There are thinkable problems and doable problems.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely. But also, is it something that somebody else has done, or somebody else could do better than I? Now, when I first found myself at Tsukiji some 13 years ago, I looked around and I thought, my goodness, this is a fascinating place, but it's inaccessible to me. Thinking at that time about linguistic problems and access problems, and simply I didn't know enough about fish. Over the years, I've thought again and again and again about, well, Tsukiji would be sort of interesting. And a couple of years ago, I found myself back at Tsukiji interviewing some people about some other things. And suddenly, the idea clicked that I could look at Tsukiji not from the perspective of a fisheries scientist and not from the perspective of an economist, but as looking at Tsukiji as a social institution, as an anthropologist might.
Just beginning to teach, I had to teach the whole Japan. But then from criticisms of my book, for example, I realized I should do something more specific in some part of Japan. And I dealt with half of Japan, and it's women. But still, you know, too broad. So finally, I came up with a very tiny group of people. These are aristocrats. It's in total about 1,000 households. Mm-hmm. And yet, the diversity within this small group is just overwhelming.
How did they react to you coming in to talk to them, to interview them?
Some rejected me totally from the very beginning because they thought I was a journalist. And they were just fed up of the scandalization by the media. And so in that case, I had to explain, of course, who I was. And being a professor was quite convincing to them. Mm-hmm. I had much easier access to ordinary people. And I just called them and explain why I want to see them and so on. There was no, practically very little resistance. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I had to have introduction, personal introduction, each time, in each interview.
To the aristocrats?
Yes, introduction by somebody they trust.
It was a very long series of contacts and introductions that brought me from Boston, Massachusetts to Tsuruoka, the castle town. It wasn't the ski. The rice and the rice wine may have had something to do with it. But I think if I count just the direct links between Boston and Tsuruoka, there were at least 10 people who passed me along one to another in the course of 5 or 6 months.
But I think the thing that many people, including anthropologists who don't work particularly in an ethnographic mode, don't think about or don't realize is the amount of work and planning that an anthropologist in the field puts into arranging to meet the right people to ask those questions and solicit those anecdotes, if that's what you want to call them. I'm sure you've had the same experience again and again.
Or to learn what the questions are that need to be asked. And one of the dramatic, for me, dramatic little incidents that brought that home in the Shima research was one day when the divers couldn't go out and dive because the weather was bad. Jackie, my wife, and I were asking questions like good intellectual professor types about knowledge of the reefs and whatnot. And finally, one of the ladies, in a nice way, but just slightly exasperated, with a little smile on her face, said, "Professor, learning this kind of work isn't like what you do in school, you know." And then suddenly it hit me, we're asking the questions in the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience in the beginnings of my research at the fish market. It wasn't until I'd seen it with my own eyes. It wasn't until I was there at 3:30 in the morning watching people unloading fish and arranging them for auctions that I began to understand precisely why these different kinds of occupations were important. And again, I could have asked questions till I was blue in the face and gotten very helpful answers from people, but without seeing it, without understanding what they're actually doing, I don't know the right questions to ask, or I don't know the right way to phrase them.
And there's just no substitute. You can't do it by a survey. You got to be there when things happen. You got to see people blush when there's some occasion to blush. You can't just hear what they say.
Or all the times the anthropologist has to blush because of all the stupid mistakes we make and stupid questions.
I no
we
longer
ask.
blush. No longer blush. That's why I keep going back to the same place. You can't go in and just say, what do you think about this? Because then it's out of context. And I have to wait until the context comes, and I can't create the context. Then it would be artificial.
If you have a list of questions, I always find it in the way of finding something interesting. So even though I do prepare questions, usually disregard it. And just going into whatever they want to tell me.
I've had to adjust my research style, I suppose, a lot in moving from my earlier research on a neighborhood community where my wife and I lived for roughly 2 years. And we used to joke that my research would come knocking at our door, virtually any hour of the day or night, because somebody would drop by to say hello or to talk to us or to bring us something or ask us a question or whatever. And now doing research on a fish market, I've had to come to terms with the fact that you can't be a participant observer all the time. I've become much better at sort of stand-up interviews, the 5-minute conversation with a little notebook in hand, almost like a reporter, simply catching somebody, if I can get them for a couple of minutes, and asking 2 or 3 quick questions and promising to come back tomorrow and bother them again.
It started really because I have 2 colleagues in North America who had been working in this area for some time, and we decided that I would try and use the same questionnaire in Japan. Now, of course, this had to be modified enormously.
Right. Often some of the most important things you learn are what you learn going through that process
exactly,
of modifying
of
the
translating and changing the questions and so on. The Japanese language, as you know, is very, very sensitive to minor body changes and makes all sorts of distinctions that we can't make in English. And when the people who were helping me with translating this questionnaire, when we were talking about this, they would laugh and they would say, oh, you English speakers, you're so dull about your bodies. You just don't have the right language to talk about it at all. By the way, I'm uncomfortable with even using the word menopause when we're talking about the Japanese sample, because menopause is not the same thing as the Japanese experience, and therefore I try to use the Japanese word most of the time, koonenki. The biostatistician has done all sorts of fancy manipulations, careful double checkings and so on, and we're really now satisfied that we're dealing with something which is not a universal experience, and that there is there is a different biological activity going on. Now, this is not to say that it is totally different. There are some Japanese women who experience something which seems to be like a hot flash, but the numbers of them are very, very small compared with Western women.
The name of the game seems to be changing.
In what ways?
I'll way overstate it, but it's almost as if the center, it's as if they've said, let's just forget about agriculture.
I guess my feeling is it's not so much that the demise of agriculture has been greatly exaggerated, but the presence of agriculture has been greatly exaggerated. Yes, I think you're right, that the national government is even more serious now than it was 10 years ago about eliminating subsidies to agriculture, which it understands full well is to eliminate most viable agriculture. But in fact, agriculture has for some time not been that important.
Did you ever get back home in the evening and say, gee, I wish I'd been born an aristocrat?
Never. Never. I didn't think, in fact, the opposite was true. Every time I did an interview, I thought, oh, I'm so glad I wasn't.
What's the big question you keep asking yourself about Japan, about Japanese culture?
And I thought that culture existed at some community, societal, national level. Culture doesn't exist there. It doesn't exist in the community. It doesn't even exist in the family. It exists in individual heads.
But what does this do, though, to all those Japanese cultural spokesman who keep saying that, no, the essence of at least one line of Japanese culture is in the villages.
Nonsense. Sorry.
You said it, I didn't.
With due respects, nonsense.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in now are the individual decisions and what goes on in individual heads that results in these decisions as these people are faced with the changing world around them. Yesterday I had a marvelous dinner with an elite family representative who's a scholar, so he can both intellectualize and live out these kinds of things. He's cosmopolitan, he's international. This guy, you would think, would not have these traditional Japanese values. He also has very strong concerns about continuity of his family line. Why this should change? Because the economic situation of Japan has changed. Why the arrogance of Western thought that when Japan finally gets its act together, they will think like we think.
I think the most important message that anything I've done so far might have for an American audience is that Japan embodies a much wider diversity of people, of occupations, of ideas, of beliefs, of families than we normally assume if we were to base our view simply on what you see in American television or American newspapers. Somewhere in the last 15 years, the image of Japan as a society of white-collar workers rushing off to work in the morning, being pushed into trains, working until 11:30 at night, coming home, doing it all over again 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, has become so entrenched in our thinking, in our images, that I think it's important to realize that that's an important fraction of Japan, but it's not the only fraction of Japan.
If I were to pick one thing in terms of self-criticism of what we as Japan scholars have been doing so far, where have we most fallen down so far? I think we've not really adequately gotten across that sense of the diversity of Japanese life.